So this is a study on self-attachment. Self-attachment is basically how we feel about ourselves, how we are able to connect with ourselves. Basically, this study, which is an internal study, is about healing the disintegrative self-attachment. So when we're no longer feeling a secure attachment to ourselves. This presents research results on self-attachment, so self-integration, and also how it correlates with intimate betrayal. C.G. Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And then author Guy Corneau said, what we don't have has us. And those really speak to the idea of self-attachment. So attachment style to ourselves, what we're really looking at is the dissonance between how we are in the world, so what we think or believe of ourselves, usually based in the influence of our outer worlds as we develop or grow up, and our true higher selves, our individuated, authentic selves, who we are without the influence of the outside world. That's really who we aspire to be as well, to get to that person. We have found that this changes quite like and somewhat related to our attachment styles with others. To study this, we developed a questionnaire that was based on the original Experiences in Close Relationships questionnaire created by Chris Fraley and his compatriots. This has undergone development since we started it in 2018, and it's on its 4th version. This is also an ongoing internal study, of course, so we've had 6 years so far. We're looking to just keep this going for as long as we can. So let's look at how the unmet childhood needs, or trauma, drivetrain, separates us or disintegrates us from ourself and changes our self-beliefs and behaviors. This is a process I lovingly call adulteration. So here's kind of how we start. Sort of when we're born, essentially, before we can even cognate or think, we're our true whole self, our unadulterated higher self. In essence, we're fully integrated because we've had no influences so far. Granted, we can't think yet, explicitly like we can as adults or young children even. However, this is basically before any kind of influence is coming along, with the exception of our right brain. Our emotional regulation or regulating side of the brain is developing at about 5 months prior to birth. So while we're still in vitro, we're developing that side of our brain. So we're actually taking on perceptions from what our mother is feeling at that time. So one could say there's already influence before we're born. Then what happens is some sort of initiating event. Obviously, this is going to be several initiating events over our childhood. So it could be the event is sort of an action, somewhat like being abandoned or neglected. But it can also be a non-event, so the absence of something deserved or needed. So things like positive attention or attunement, where mom is looking into baby's eyes and that baby feels really attuned and thus attached to mom. And so that break or an abruption in that can lead the baby to feeling like the world is to be feared, that they're not going to be safe, they're not going to be loved, they're not going to be warm, they're not going to have their essential needs met. And so that can be an initiating event, often is, especially in people who experience deep shame and disconnection from the world. Then what happens is we're going to have a compounding event. Now, a compounding event can look the same. It can be the same, but it can also look very different, but similar. So let's say that the initiating event is, a young child is told, what are you, stupid? By a parent or something, is accused of being stupid because maybe they don't do well in school, or they mess up or do something against the parent's expectation. And the compounding event could be the exact same thing. Another event where they disappoint the parent and the parent says something that tells them that they're less than. It can also be something where another child says you're stupid or you're an idiot, and so that becomes a compounding event. But again, it's along the same or similar lines. Now, what then happens is we have all of these compounding events that add to it. Now, if you look at the purple one there, that could be something that really doesn't seem very same or similar. Let's say that is failing a test, when you're typically a very good student, or in a particular subject, you're a very good student. And the teacher says to you, who you really like and have a great relationship with this teacher, they say to you, what happened? What happened here? This isn't usual for you. And instead of hearing that as loving concern from your teacher who really wants to find out what's going on because something is obviously different, you are then taking that as that original idea that, see, even my great teacher thinks I'm stupid. So that's how those compounding events work. So what ends up happening is you end up, after all these compounding events, with a disintegrated self. Now, obviously, these are many events, so you would see a lot of these sort of compounding events moving out. You could really just fill the whole page with those, but you do end up with a disintegrated self. So now what happens is this. Really, what we're looking at here is over time and all of those compounding events, you see a distortion or change in your core beliefs about yourself and about the world. So from a belief in who I really am, my true whole higher self, to a belief in who and what I am told I am, or believe I have to be in order to get my needs met. So usually that comes from childhood messages, both direct and indirect. And then they are compounded and deepened into adulthood. Now, here's what else happens at the same time. And that is that we have concurrent changes in our behaviors to fit those distorted or changed core beliefs. So we go from behaviors that are really consonant with our higher self, with our integrated self, to dissonant and maladaptive behaviors that support and deepen the changed or distorted core beliefs about ourselves. In a sense, what that really means is, let's say you go from being this wonderful pure child to being a rebel. So think the guys with the greasy hair and the leather jacket on motorcycles back in James Dean days. What you've done there is to be told, perhaps at your initiating event, right, and compounding events, you're just no good. You don't know how to be polite. You don't know how to fit in with society. There's something wrong with you. And so really what ends up happening is you change your behaviors to fit that new belief that you've taken on about yourself. And that separates you further and further and further from who you are. The problem also with those behaviors is that they also deepen our belief that we are who we're told we are, or who we've had to be in order to fulfill our basic human needs. So that's really problematic, of course, because then we really start to believe that this is who I am. So when I'm at my disintegrated self, I'm now believing that's who I am, and yet I've got a feeling inside of a split or a conflict. So when I'm in my disintegrated self, I'm absolutely conflicted between that and that sort of internal knowledge of what my integrated self is. That creates massive anxiety, because anxiety is about conflict and internal conflict. So how does this translate into this self-attachment or attachment with ourselves, with our true deeper self? We're looking at 4 quadrants. This is Chris Fraley's model of close relationships and attachment. So the one up in the left-hand corner there, secure, is the one where we would really love to be. And that's when we're integrated with our whole self. Obviously, there's a range there. As you can see, the farther towards the word secure that you are, the more integrated you are. In this, we're going to be self-aware. These sorts of ideas go with it. I feel connected with myself. I am kind to myself. I am reparenting my inner children. I act within my integrity. I feel free of major conflict and anxiety. I can emotionally regulate, and I know myself. So when we move down to dismissive, this would be a hypo self-awareness. In other words, less than the average self-awareness. So I often feel or go numb. I'm better off alone. I'm just blank. You demean, criticize, disregard yourself, especially convincing yourself that you're either too much, not enough, unworthy, you don't matter, or not on the same level as others. Then we go over to fearful avoidant. If you look at the scale, you're looking at an avoidance scale on your y-axis, an anxiety scale on your x-axis. Now we're talking pretty high anxiety and high avoidance. This is a place where we're hypervigilant. We feel that we have to manage our image with others, so our persona, so that they don't find us out. Typical thought is, I'm a fraud. At this point, you're ruminating a lot and feeling anxious and conflicted a lot. I find myself planning or thinking about defending myself. Who am I? I am fearful of becoming who I really am, which is a thing because that's unknown. This out here that I've learned for so long is already known to me. So the unknown always creates fear and anxiety, even though when we're growing and moving towards it, that's actually a positive anxiety. So we have to be able to discern between negative and positive anxiety, and that we can do that by looking at what are we doing? How are we growing? Are we growing? If we're growing, then that's a positive anxiety. It feels the same as a negative anxiety where we're sitting or acting out or acting in our persona. That's a negative. So if we evaluate what we're doing at the very moment, we can actually ascribe positive or negative anxiety. Positive anxiety is okay. It means I'm growing, I'm enhancing myself. Negative anxiety is not okay because it means that I'm essentially diminishing myself. We're negatively hyper aware when we're in preoccupied. I have to manage my image with others, and I'll go outside of my integrity in service to that, including people pleasing. So self sacrifice, which is more of a voluntary giving up of ourselves, and subjugation, where we feel like we don't have a choice. So it's involuntary in that. It doesn't mean that somebody else is necessarily putting it on us. It's something that we take on, but we feel like we don't have any choice in that. I ruminate a lot and feel anxious and conflicted a lot. Notice that's very similar to the fearful avoidant, and this is an anxiety piece. I find myself planning or thinking about defending myself. I want to discover myself, but I never will, yet I work on it out of fear of staying in my current state. So it's this constant sort of existential angst, grief, anxiety. Here's what happens if we're actually positively working on self-attachment or inner work. That preoccupied actually becomes positive. So I was talking about positive anxiety in that preoccupation wasn't surrounding the self-criticism as it is in the negative, but looking more deeply and curiously at ourselves. And this actually lessens our anxiety significantly as long as we recognize what we're doing that's creating the sort of positive anxiety. Okay, so if we're integrated, there we are in the secure quadrant, so we're feeling securely attached. Now what happens with the disintegrating events is basically this. So we can go down into the dismissive, we can go into the fearful avoidant, and we can go into the preoccupied. If we're going down into the dismissive attachment, then what we're going to feel is very to extremely high shame. Usually there's deep trauma in childhood, many largely unmet childhood needs. So those things that we didn't get that we needed and deserved. Low to moderate anxiety, very high depression. They are the most likely people to have suicidal ideation. In our study on betrayal trauma, which I have to say was all men were the acting out partners and all the betrayed partners were women. So in terms of initial testing, 17% of the males who are acting out partners were actually in the dismissive place. So dealing with high shame, high depression. Anxiety is there. It's on the same spectrum as depression, but mostly it's about moderate in this quadrant. So 4%, that's a marked difference. 4% of the women, the betrayed partners, were in the dismissive place about themselves. Now we go over to when disintegrated self is in the fearful avoidant attachment quadrant, and then we're looking at a moderate to high to very high shame. So notice that the shame in both dismissive and fearful avoidant is very often very high. Usually there are traumatic events in childhood, many unmet childhood needs. Notice both of those are slightly improved over the dismissive. Moderate to high anxiety, so obviously we're in a higher anxiety quadrant here, so that's to be expected. And then depression is still at that very high plus, but nowhere near as much suicidal ideation here. In this one, 55% of men, the acting out partners, were in the fearful avoidant quadrant or had a fearful avoidant attachment to themselves. 42% of betrayed partners who are women had that fearful avoidant attachment to themselves. Then we go up into when there's a preoccupied attachment with the self, and that's going to be a moderate to high shame. Notice how shame is throughout these. It's something that we really have to pay attention to. Usually, some traumatic events in childhood. So we're talking about actions like abandonment, neglect, abuse, that kind of thing. Although abuse, you're going to find much more in the dismissive and the fearful avoidant than in the preoccupied. There are going to be many unmet childhood needs. That is usual. And it's unfortunate because nobody gets out of childhood whole. And that's the problem. So not everybody experiences trauma or traumatic events, not even little t or big T. We prefer to look at it as negative events. Basically, that childhood needs are not being met or fulfilled. To the extent that they are not, is the extent that problematic issues are going to be there. So let's say they're met 60%, you still have 40% that haven't been met, and those are going to cause behavioral issues. They're going to cause doubt in self. They're going to cause you to be in one of these disintegrated attachment styles. There's also going to be very high anxiety and then moderate depression. In this preoccupied, we had 28% were the male acting out partners and 54% were the betrayed partners. So that's a very interesting stat in that 54% of women were in the preoccupied. Interestingly, there's a lot of bouncing around, especially between preoccupied and fearful avoidant. The generally observed attachment change followed a counterclockwise pattern. So people who started off in the dismissive attachment style with themselves actually then would, as they improved, as they did some inner work, would actually move counterclockwise into the fearful avoidant. And then from the fearful avoidant, or anybody who started in fearful avoidant, would move to the preoccupied. And then generally speaking, the preoccupied would begin movement to the secure. One thing to note here is actually getting into the secure attachment takes a lot of work. This is not something that we measure in terms of weeks or months. There can be plenty of movement. So that's where that beautiful piece is. There can be movement in this, but to actually get into that really highly secure place is really to realize the results of your inner work, your individuation, as Jung called it. And even Jung would probably say that he never reached that height. So this is a lifetime of progressive work. The initial stuff, though, can show huge returns, which we will get to. So this is what it looks like. All right, so let's talk about additional findings. While the changes that we discussed were averaged over time, there can be considerable regressive and progressive movement, which can be momentary. So that means in the moment, generally as a reaction to an outside stimulus or trigger. Or they can be protracted. So we can actually regress from one to the other or partial movement, and then we can get stuck there sometimes. The deal is typically it'll move around a lot, but you're going to see over time that positive movement as long as the inner work is being done. Successful relationship recovery was highly correlated with self-work designed to heal that disintegration from self. Really, the more inner work that was done, the better relationships, both the primary relationship between the couple and others, were reported to be using the experiences in relationships, short form. So really, if you do the inner work, the relational recovery is going to be better. This was not correlated to achieving a secure attachment with self, but to continued work and gradual overall movement towards secure. While we did this research over 6 years, with a varied amount of time and treatment for each participant, the progress of participants towards secure attachment with themselves showed a general counterclockwise movement, like we talked about through the styles. Okay, so that more progress was made generally with more focused work on self-attachment. A faster growth pace was correlated with existing resilience, learned resilience during treatment, shame reduction during treatment, and anxiety and depression treatment, both psychotherapeutically and pharmacologically. Not everybody did pharmacological interventions on anxiety and mostly depression we're talking about. But those who did experience a faster self-attachment growth. Progress was slowest with those who started with a dismissive attachment style. Progress was slower amongst those with deeper traumatic experience and those with a highest ratio of unmet childhood needs without necessarily having to have a single deeply traumatic event. Those people who have the slowest would have an unmet childhood need where only 20% of it was met, and they had 80% that was not met. Sort of much more in that way than the reverse of, say, what we had said before, 60-40. So also it was slower among those who were reporting a higher overall level of shame. Here's an unexpected result, and that is that 62% of participants who were betrayed partners, they were diagnosed with complex PTSD, resulted in faster progress towards self-integration than the average of all participants, both betrayed partners and acting out partners. So if a betrayed partner works on their inner self, works on the self-attachment, which can be likened to safety, stability, and so on in the APSATS MPTM model, then we actually saw that their progress was faster in terms of moving through betrayal, but also moving towards a secure self-attachment. Now, 84% of the remaining 38% of the participants, so those who did not experience faster progress towards self-integration, were seeking treatment for the first time more than 2 to 9 years after first discovery, and had experienced further betrayals such as partial and multiple discoveries and disclosures. They also had tended to get stuck in the investigative phase, so that their trauma was actually deepening because they were not finding a way into safety over that time. Overall, as participants focused on their own self-attachment work, they reported becoming more shame resilient. That is, better able to work through their shame and move into a feeling of healthy guilt that they could work with. Less anxious, less depressed, more relationally connected, more emotionally vulnerable, more communicative and collaborative with their partners, more empathetic, especially acting out partners toward their betrayed partner in this, and overall with others in their lives. Less angry and rageful, and those with children reported feeling closer, more loving, and connected with their children. Let's take a look really quickly at some suggestions for how inner work can be done. Come to us. So we work in this way, in a psychodynamic way. We use experiential right brain therapies because they immediately access the right side of the brain, which is the emotional regulation center of the brain. We use psychoeducational, we use depth psychology, in our case Jungian. So we're working sort of from the inside out, which is really what Jung called individuation. So bringing the unconscious drives into consciousness. Trauma reprocessing, so EMDR attachment, EMDR deter, which is the triggers and urges protocol, and the felt sense protocol. Cognitive behavioral therapy, so this is kind of a working the behaviors from the outside in towards the depth, and reparenting work. So that's inner child work, parts work, meeting your unmet childhood needs as an adult. And when we talk about unmet childhood needs, we have developed a matrix of 26 unmet childhood needs that we rank with each individual, and then those are run through a very complex formula, a weighted formula, to give us 5 different unmet childhood needs drives, what we call the drivetrain, and those are occurring in different percentages in each person. So imagine a graphic equalizer, if you will, bouncing up and down. That's different from each person, right? And so that way we can target which drives are the biggest for each person and how to work with those drives. So we're consistently do that, and with the inner child work, we're trying to reparent, which really means we're bringing in how to meet the needs that were not met in our childhood. So if you just want to get started, you can start therapy with us, with somebody who's a Jungian, with somebody who does internal family systems. You can even go to, which I do, to ACA, which is Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families. So even if your parents weren't alcoholics, you can probably say that there was some dysfunction in your family. You can do trauma work, EMDR, brain spotting, ETT. Some recommended reading for you would be my favorite, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life by James Hollis. It's beautiful, it's dense. It's basically one of those, if you were to highlight the parts that you wanted to read or you felt were important, you'd probably end up with a yellow book. So the next one is Dark Side of the Light Chasers, which is a bit of a simpler thing to read, something that is more accessible, if you will, than Hollis. But I find that Hollis really gets to the nitty gritty of it. And then lastly, the Internal Family Systems Workbook by Richard Swartz, who created the internal family systems model. Let's end with a wonderful quote by, again, Jung. In every adult, there is a child, an eternal child, something that is always becoming, is never completed, and calls for unceasing care, attention, and education. That is the part of the personality which wants to develop and become whole. And that is it for this presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time and listening. And hopefully it is really helpful. We're continuing to study this. Obviously, we do this work in practice. We have for many, many years, long before 2018. We just didn't really work on the self-attachment piece, linking it to this internal work that we were already doing until 2018. Thank you so much for listening.